Dave Poparad and Paul Dietrich. Thanks, Bob.
Sure.
Appreciate it.
How do I get screen? Okay, Jeff.
It should be set to the desk. That's not good up there. System on. Make sure this is.
I'm gonna come out there and open it up right.
Looks like it's all the
No, we have,
We approved the investing on the high end of the
Do we need to warm up?
that might be.
but they didn't know if they
You're gonna place on the new desktop. Come look on there. It says like it's on.
yeah.
Maybe try turning it off and back on.
Hey, it's a question.
Okay. So now put the
Enjoy your
okay. All right, you might as well just start and we'll
Here, I'm
fill it in.
gonna improvise here as we go, so. A little technical difficulty. But one thing I want to talk about is kind of financial concerns and process. Because you touched on processes, knowing your process from a marketing standpoint. Also having a process for your accounting and finance function. In order to plan everything going forward, you have to have a good idea of what your numbers are. So what's your financial reporting process? What's your monthly package? What's your quarterly package and your annual package? Do you need audited financial statements? Do you need a review? What's your process to sit down with your finance person, your CPA, and just kind of review your numbers and where you're at? And are you meeting your objectives? You need to have a process around that. It can be simple from a monthly standpoint, more involved from a quarterly, even more in depth from a business perspective. Just so you know your numbers, so you can plan. All we're talking from a transition, you know your numbers. So that's kind of the reporting cycle. Another thing is, and Bob touched on a little bit, is knowing your buyer. Who's your buyer and what's their objective? I mean, what are their concerns? Are they concerned about how am I going to maintain my lifestyle? And am I in it for an investment? What's going to be my debt service or my return on investment? What is that for them? If you know your buyer's concerns, you can make a presentation to tell a story from a financial picture that eases those concerns or at least addresses that. So kind of looking back and what's your exit plan and where you're going to go, that's important to know that. And then, I mean, some of you were at the last presentation, but there were some tax strategies just to kind of minimize your tax liability. And how are you doing that? Tax strategy. Thank you. Yeah. County reporting, successor financial concerns, and then tax strategies. I'm just going to touch on this real quick. I mean, minimizing your tax liability, use bonus depreciation, make sure you're accelerating depreciation. Tangible asset regulations and cost sets deals with disposals and, you know, how can you write things off sooner than if you have a building and it's over 39 years? How can you get it over 7 years, 5 or 7 years? Cost seg relates to that. If you're doing any type of development of process, website, manufacturing process, a medical process to a point, you may be able to qualify for research and development credit, which can be very significant saving your tax liability. Accounting methods are always good to look over. Are you accelerating revenue or income in a way that you could probably defer income? From a general rule of accounting, you want to You want to defer income and accelerate expenses. So what accounting methods are you doing for that? I mean, from a construction standpoint, are you using percentage of completion, or can you use completed contract? Can you do it from a commercial standpoint? Can you treat commercial one way and residential another way? There's ways you can do that. It's just sitting down and looking through it. IC disc, the domestic production reduction, which is a VPAD, you do that. The IC disc, if you're doing any foreign transactions or any foreign services, you're exporting something you manufactured, produced, you can get a deduction for that. And sometimes that is missed. If you're doing a construction project in the Bahamas, you can do it. If you're exporting hoses out to another country, okay, we can set and get a deduction for that. And that's a pretty good benefit for the point. It's a tax arbitrage play. You basically have two entities, and it's an estate planning play as well. Meaning your corporation that's selling the entity is selling it, can get an ordinary deduction of 39.6. And then the IC disc pays a dividend back to the owners or the estate, and that dividend is taxed at 23.8 max rates. So you get the tax arbitrage there between the 39.6 and the 23.8, which could be very significant. And I'm going to talk about transactions and deals and planning. And I'm kind of trying to get us back on schedule, so I'm rushing a little. But there's two basic deals in any transaction. You either got a stock exit transaction, you either got a stock sale or an asset sale. So we're going to go through an example of each and then kind of a little twist on an asset sale. So in a basic asset deal, you have your current owners and your new owners. And your company's going to transact and sell all the assets to NewCo. And then NewCo is going to give the company selling the assets cash. And then there's gain reported on that, and then there's a distribution out to the current owners. So that's basically how it works. And there's advantages and disadvantages to that. It's usually, from a buyer's perspective, they like it because they get to their step up in basis. Meaning, I'm going to pay you $1 million for your assets. Here, we'll just go there. So here's a basic purchase price allocation. You got fixed assets, inventory, and intangibles. Intangible we talked about. Bob talked about it. You know, goodwill, your workforce in place, your customer list. All those will be your intangibles. So you're going to go through this. Why a buyer likes an asset sale is because they get a step up in basis. I mean, they get to depreciate that $1 million. And they get to recapture that expense. On a stock deal, they do not. Stock deal, they basically step into the buyer's shoes. So the reason why a seller doesn't like a stock asset sale is because of the depreciation recapture. You received an ordinary deduction for those assets that you purchased as a business owner over the years. And then when you sell those assets, the gain is going to be recaptured at ordinary rates, which is going to be your 39.6%. So in this example, we have $500,000 allocated to our fixed assets. Our fixed assets have a tax basis of $50,000. Our cost basis less our accumulated depreciation. And that's going to be taxed at ordinary rates, which is at 39.6%. Not a good result. The amount in addition to the $350,000 and $100,000 will be taxed at capital gains rates. Inventory is another, call it hot asset. It's an ordinary income asset, which will again be taxed at ordinary rates, 39.6. Your intangibles, and this is where it becomes important, you talk about personal goodwill and intangibles, the things, the equity each of you are building in your business, that gets at capital gains rates. And that's going to be at a max of 23.8. The 3.8% kicks in after $250,000. It's a net investment tax from the Affordable Care Act. I mean, if income's lower, or if we do installment sales, we can alleviate some of that, of the 3.8. Here, when you do a purchase price allocation from a asset sale, you're going to have to report how the assets are broken down. even when you go through a transaction, an exit transaction, you're gonna wanna break down your assets. So the buyer and seller are in agreement of what's the allocation. And here's just kind of, this lays out the form that has to file with your tax return. You got cash, you're basically your top 3, 4 are all gonna be your ordinary income assets, taxed at 39.6. Your other assets is basically gonna be your fixed assets, which could be ordinary or it could be capital. And then your 179 assets, those are your acquired intangibles. Say you went out and you bought another business and there's goodwill already on your books. You're already acquiring it. And everything else is gonna fall out in goodwill. All your workforce in place that you've developed, the goodwill in your business, your customer list. Now we're gonna go through a stock transaction. A stock transaction is a little different in the fact that the company does ownership, no assets in the company's changes hands. It's all related to the stock changing between the owners, the 2 owners, the sellers and the new owners. So you won't get a step up in basis. I'm gonna go through this. Because here's your sales price. I need to clean this up. Basis is important in a stock transaction. Now, if you always own your company and you're 100% owner, your basis is probably similar to your retained earnings. But your basis starts with your initial capital contribution, and then it's plus or minus the income or loss throughout the years, less the distributions you've taken out, plus your additional capital, and that's where you're at. That's your basis number. And that's what you would be, so when the base is up here, the $100,000, that's basically that number you're at. And that's gonna determine your gain. Now this is very good from a seller's perspective because it's all capital gains rates. From a buyer's perspective, they don't like it because they don't get the step up in basis in that aspect. They basically step into the shoes of the seller. Meaning whatever tax attributes you have, whatever your depreciation, your net operating losses, if you're a C Corp, anything else. Your methods of accounting, all would stay the same. When an asset sale, the buyer has some elections to change those. Now we're gonna, it's an asset deal with a little twist, right? And Bob touched on some of these and non-competes and consulting agreements. And Paul's going to help touch on this. So in this scenario, the current owners of ABC Inc. are going to sell all or substantially all the assets to new ABC Inc. And new ABC Inc. is going to give them cash. Now, we talked about personal goodwill. This is things where you start putting wrinkles in transactions. You start putting non-competes, or you start putting consulting agreements on the seller saying, okay, for the next 2 years after the transaction, you're going to be a consultant for us. We're going to pay you X amount per month, and we're going to give you additional income. That's usually going to be ordinary. And you try to lock things up on a contingency agreements or consulting agreements. How do you lock up the seller for a period of time to give you, the buyer, some protection, saying they're not going to take your business, they're going to help you. They're not going to ruin your market share or ruin your customer base. How do you protect yourself during that time? And that's something Paul can add to a little bit as far as how we can kind of protect those items.
Right, yeah, let me just put a little meat on the bone, because Bob talked about it, Dave's talked about it a little bit as well. And there's somebody just give you a little bit of legal knowledge, and it kind of goes back to, about history and our economy. We're a free market system, or at least supposed to be. If you're a small business owner, you may think that the government's too involved in your company, and that, quite frankly, is a movement away from our founding principles. But the idea is that employees essentially, you're supposed to be able to kind of work where you want to work, when you want to work, and do what you want to do. That's kind of how our economy is kind of founded on the free market system. So the government, though, has created some restrictions to kind of arm people's ability to work, and they take them very, very seriously, and so they put them in and write them down and put them in our Florida statutes. So the Florida statute 542 has a section that allows for non-competes to exist. Okay, if it were not for the Florida statutes, people could do whatever they wanted and could act however they wanted when the business got sold, or an employee could kind of take trade secrets and move them somewhere else. So the Florida legislature at some point in time agreed to go ahead and move against the free market system and create situations where it makes sense for people to contractually restrict themselves as to what they can do and where they can do it. So for instance, one of the things I want to advise you is that these things are entirely enforceable. There's kind of a mythology out there that a lot of employees will have an idea is that you can't enforce non-competes. It's not true, okay? Non-competes, the statute created kind of a structure where, in general terms, if a non-compete is of a duration of less than 6 months, it'll almost entirely be enforced, okay? It's not a long period of time, right? But it's still something. The alternative is any non-compete that goes beyond 2 years, all right, is presumed to be unreasonable, okay? But it's only a presumption, and you can overcome that. Because what the statute says is that enforcement of non-competes are okay that are reasonable in time, area, and line of business. Okay, so we talked about time, which is you know, if you're less than 6 months, you're fine. Over two years, you've got an argument to make as to why you should be able to enforce it. The sweet spot is somewhere in the middle, which is why you see most non-compete at 2 years. Okay, that's where you find it. Okay, area. Everybody has an impression about what their area is. Okay, so and it depends on your line of business. And so we used to just kind of look at the county you were in, or kind of where your area, where you thought your area of influence was, and courts have become much more restrictive nowadays. They really want you to prove that your non-compete that you put in place with a seller or with an employee actually reflects what you do for a living. So for instance, I do work for a barbecue restaurant, okay? So the barbecue restaurant, I went to the barbecue restaurant owner and I said, where's your area? He goes, people come from all over to visit my barbecue restaurant. But the trouble is they drive by about 8 or 10 barbecue restaurants to get there. There's a barbecue restaurant around almost every other corner in Orlando. You get it from the judge and you say, I need the state of Florida to cover if my chef leaves, he can't work in the state of Florida because my barbecue's that good. The judge is not going to enforce that. Especially because you've got a restaurant that's kind of serving a certain community area. Other examples would be a higher end restaurant. I also do a lot of restaurant work. There's a farm to table restaurant that pulls people in from a countywide area. They've got a different argument, right? Because they're a less common offering. I was thinking about the pediatrics operation, the nightlight operation. I was thinking about how you guys pull from a larger area. People, you're a destination. You don't go driving looking for a hospital or a bank. People know where you're going. They've identified where they want to go, and they drive to your location. You would have an argument that you're serving a large demographical area, and so you would be able to kind of convince, hopefully, the judge that you'd be able to essentially say, our 5-mile radius is what works, or a 10-mile radius. And so that if you're an employee or if you're a seller and you leave and you take our business and you try and create the same sort of business within a 5-mile radius, you'd be able to kind of convince the judge that you had some basis, a reasonable basis for doing so. Now, you serve the Southeast, right? You probably go beyond the Southeast, but I'm aware of the Southeast United States. I mean, you could reasonably create a non-compete that started there. You may not prevail, but you've got a reasonable opportunity to get in front of the judge and say, look, we serve home builders in the Southeast, right? If I train up an employee, or if I'm selling a business and I want to go out, I would understand it'd be reasonable that a buyer would not want me to do the same thing within that large of an operation, that large of an area. And some people have internet sales. I think you just international importing as well. And so I think it's, you know, you can use the entire earth can be reasonable if you can actually prove it out. So I just want to give an idea that you're talking about time, we're talking about area, but they're all kind of focused on what exactly they can do for a living and how reasonable is it to protect that. I also want to say a few things about, we're not just talking about non-competes, all right? There's also, non-compete's easy, don't do the same thing I'm doing, right? There's also a thing called non-recruitment, right? Which is that you will not go out and start a business and then reach back in and try and recruit my employees back away from me, okay? Non-recruitment. You've got a thing called non-solicitation, right? Which is that you will not go to my customers. Once you leave my operation, you will not reach out to my customers, and you will not go and try and move their business away from me and toward you. And the one thing that I'm really glad Bob talked about earlier was he talked about concentration of vendors. And that's a real risk for a lot of people. And so one of the things that we write into our non-competes, into our structures, is that if you go out and you form another company, you will not be able to order goods or services from our vendors, such that we might have a hard time getting those goods and vendors supplied to us, okay? Because that means if you've got a concentration of vendors, then all of a sudden, you see a situation where there's a dearth of supply that's available to you, perhaps in your metal business, defense business. If you saw, your supplier's inability to kind of serve what you need because you had a competitor who used to work for you pulling in that direction, that would be an issue that would impact you greatly. So anyway, it's not just about non-competes. There are certain subcategories that can also put into these structures that will protect you and that are enforceable under Florida law as long as they're reasonable.
Okay. Can you explain in a little bit more detail the difference between a non-compete and a non-solicitation and how those are different a little bit, because I think we kind of get them interchangeable at times. So
Right.
just kind of clear that up a little bit.
Right, because the non-competes are essentially already operating in the same space, and they essentially involve kind of taking the processes, sometimes taking the trade secrets, which are also quite protected, sometimes taking just the confidential information. And so anytime that you kind of take your expertise as an employee or as a seller of a business and operate in the same space, in competition for the same sort of customers that one company is providing, then that's your non-compete situation. Non-solicitation really kind of goes to the heart of fortifying your new company at the detriment of a prior company. And so you're essentially taking the intellectual property of your former company and you're dragging it over through the ability of recruiting and of either employees, mainly the customers. We had a case once where, and believe it or not, we got this enforced, but there was a high-end beauty salon that, and if you're in the beauty salon world, you know that customers shift and go with their stylists. And so we had a forward-thinking owner, and she had her stylist and her non-competes. And when a few of them moved, she went after them, and she wanted to send a message. And we didn't think we could make that happen because the general sense in the community was that your customer base is the phone book, right? I mean, but we were able to get the non-compete enforced, and we had an injunction filed against the stylist who had actually taken customers from my client's salon because we had a written document, it's got to be in writing, that prohibited the stylists from reaching back in and grabbing customers who happen to be just kind of, people who kind of, not so much hair tests, but more like hiring hairstyling, and essentially saying that we had developed techniques, right, that were proprietary. We had gone through training. I had sent them off onto conferences to learn how to do hair a certain way. And at that point, when they left the shop, they took all of that intellectual property with them. And we have an agreement in place that says they can't do that. And so you can extend that, you can extrapolate that to any other business, and that will to indicate that even at that level, you can enforce these agreements.
What's the importance of having those agreements in place when you initiate your relationship with your employee versus 2 years after they've been working with you?
Yeah, it's it's really a relational issue with the employee, because oftentimes it's once you establish the goodwill with an employee, you don't want to go back to them and say, oh, by the way, clearly I consider you a threat because now I'm making you sign something. And so from an employment law standpoint, you're always better off up front, not only having an employee manual, but also having, for your higher level people or the ones that can become a threat, right, in the future, if your business plan indicates that you're going to go in a certain direction and you're going to educate certain people, develop them, mentor them, provide them with processes that will allow them to go out into the work, into the community and bring in clientele, then those are people that are threats to your business, and you want to nurture them, right, and mentor them. You want them to succeed and be happy, but you also want them to have the ground rules early on. So the answer is, we always recommend that you start off on a foot that we are a business that protects our interests, right?
It impacts enforceability as well.
Yeah, it does, and it goes back to part of the branding issue as well, because people who they may not look at the employment agreement and say, this is some sort of relationship I want to get into, right, because this is a restriction, but I also see this is a company that is intentional about how they do business. They're intentional about making a profit, doing well, protecting their interests for on a long-term basis. And so you do the math, your employee, you do the math and you say, all right, I don't like what I'm signing, but I like the fact that the company is thinking about these things for the benefit of all of us, because it does create the likelihood, the more likelihood that they're going to be a success, because they really care about these protections.
I think,
I'm sorry.
go ahead, Mark. Go ahead.
On the solicitation, surely a judge can say to a customer, he's got equal rights to buy from whoever he wants, so how can that be a rule?
Right. And it's you're not preventing the customer, right? This is not, there's no non-compete that's enforceable against a third party, okay? So you can't go to the customer, who's not a party to the lawsuit, right? Right, but you can do, the non-competes that I create all have in writing remedies involved in conjunctive release. And so essentially you're not really getting damages, you're not really, getting any sort of an award, but what you are doing is there's a judgment that says you can't do this anymore. Okay, and so so judges will enforce it if they feel like, number one, it was a clear understanding, it was reasonable, right? And you have to prove some level of damage, okay, as well. You can't just kind of say this, I'm doing this for fun. You have to actually be damaged by the activity. And if that's the case, then a judge will enforce it. Now, to the extent that how that can be enforced, right, is kind of a thought experiment, because you actually have to be diligent as an owner or diligent as someone who's enforcing it to kind of track activity, sometimes investigative services, and once you kind of lay the groundwork what's going on, then you get in front of the judge and you say, we had a deal, I was reasonable in my protections, they agreed to it, and now they're in violation of it, I'm being harmed, so please enforce it. Most judges will go along with it if you document it.
Thank you.
And I think kind of add to that, you can kind of add to that from a tax planning or planning to exit scenario. Or if there's a key employee that's not on non-compete now, but hey, you want a succession plan for them, you think they're in line, or there's another employee within your business that's in line to take over for you. We can structure a deal that says, here, we're going to do this for you, we're going to put you on a bonus plan, and part of that bonus is going to be basically to buy the company. You're going to get 100% bonus awarded to you, whatever factors you want to put to it, and you're going to hold back 50% of that to pay down the purchase price. But in order to do that, hey, I'm going to lock you up with this non-compete, because I'm going to open up the business to you. And I don't want you taking all my secrets and won't have to start it now. So there's ways you can lock that down and line it up with a succession plan and say, hey, Mr. and Mrs. Smith, you're going to be great for this business. I think you can take it over. I want to exit in 5 years. Let's start planning. And then you help me grow up from here saying, okay, the business is at $10 million today. You give me up to $15 million. I'll share that growth with you as part of the purchase price and lock in the purchase price at $10 million. So you both share in the growth as you move up. So there's ways you can plan for
So
that.
legally, does that make a non-compete more enforceable if there's compensation offered?
Yes.
As in, here's a defined bonus program, or
Right,
I'm offering.
that's right. Because the assumption always is that the employer has the leverage, right? That it was a contract of adhesion where if you wanted this job, you had to sign it.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like a rental car agreement. You know, you don't read it, just sign it. But if you can prove as an employer that, hey, we worked this thing out, there was a negotiation, I paid for this non-compete.
Yeah.
You know, then absolutely.
Okay.
Can it be for a specific period of time?
Yes.
To say, okay, we're gonna have a 5-year run to make this work out or something, or what?
Well, we're going through this right now. We just had 3 people leave. They took all the information, so we didn't have non-compete. So we're gonna put a non-compete in, but we've been advised to say, okay, for the next 12 months, you sign this non-compete because you've been here for 15 years and we love you, but we're gonna make you sign a non-compete. We're gonna pay you an extra 3% commission for the next 12 months in order to compensate you for signing this non-compete.
You see that with the severance agreement as well too. If you want to let someone go, you can probably speak to that more, but if you let someone go, say, okay, I'm gonna give you a 2-month severance package or 3 months. I don't have to, but in exchange for that, hey, you're gonna sign this confidential agreement, non-solicitation. That's a way to slide in there too. That way they're getting incentivized for signing it, and then you have the compensation exchange there. I pay you for this contract clause.
And I'm sorry if you covered this already, maybe you did just tell me that you did, but if we have current employees that aren't on a non-compete and we need to get them on it, the talks come up that, well, you can't just make them sign a non-compete. You have to give them something for it.
Right.
Is that true?
No, it's a leverage play, right? You have to be able to kind of stand behind the threat of non-employment, of termination.
Right.
That's the issue. Which is tough to do. I mean, you're working with, these are valued employees we're talking about, right?
Yeah, I mean, otherwise we wouldn't.
I mean, we're all, before they leave and take your business, they're all great, right?
If they're not valued, I want them to go to my competitors.
Right, right. Right. So it's really a matter of kind of, the most effective way to do it is essentially let them look behind the curtain a little bit, right? To understand what it's like to be an owner and to be in your position, to have a communication, to essentially talk about the fact that, you know what, this wasn't part of your deal when you signed up for this, okay? But we're in a position right now where, for me to actually grow this place, I need to be able to for me to actually prove to my lenders and to prove to people that are backing me, and prospective long-term customers, that they need to know that my people are in place, right? And that I've done a good job of kind of creating an environment where they're going to stay. And so to do that, here's a document I'd like you to review. I'd like you to come back to me in a week and let's talk about it. But this is the landscape going forward, because I've got to protect my business, and part of that is protecting you, right? It doesn't feel like it, but my restriction on you is also a protection of you, okay? Because it protects the business and the income flow, my ability to pay your salary. Right. So there's a way. I agree. You slap down a piece of paper and say, sign it. I know we're buds, and I trust you, but not really. So you're going to create an environment that is toxic.
Yeah.
But if you do
especially if it's a little
right, but if you do it in a way that essentially where there is compensation, right, potentially, maybe, or you create incentives, or you kind of allow them to rationalize the decision in a way that makes sense for them.
We're gonna kind of move. I just want to touch on this real quick, but this is our asset sale again. But what I want you guys to take away from this is, in this scenario, we have a consulting agreement. In that scenario, we're okay. As a buyer, I'm going to give you a seller consulting agreement. You're going to help me transition this business to make sure it keeps going in its current state. What you have to be cautious of is the tax effect on that, because you're going to be at ordinary rates. Plus, you're going to be at the self-employment. You're going to pay the payroll taxes on that as well. So it's going to be up there. And if you have a high net worth, you're going to start losing your itemized deductions and your personal exemptions. So you do the math on it, that can get up to 54% pretty quick, just because you're losing those deductions. So it's significant when you start talking about taking on that. Are there ways to plan around that? Yes. Can we still say, okay, I'm going to sell all the assets out of my company. I'm going to be the only remaining employee in the company. I'm going to set up a pension plan for myself. I'm going to look to defer that consulting rate consulting agreement funds to when I retire. So I don't pay the tax today. I'm gonna pay it when I retire and then take it out at that point. So there's things you can do to plan it. Just with that, everything we're talking about, it takes a process and planning and where you want to go, and then how do we protect your interest and get you to reduce tax liability. So, I gotta tell you, acquisition agreements, and when you get ready to exit, don't skim over the tax aspects of what's there. It's important. It can have a deep effect on what happens. How is that transaction structured? What's going to be the effect to you? It's a due diligence tool. Here's a good slide. I like this. All these tax reps, covenant non-competes, and working capital adjustments are all kind of working together. So when you exit your business, the buyers, there's going to be, okay, you're going to go through a due diligence period, you're going to negotiate, and then you're going to say, okay, here's the numbers, but you're not going to know the numbers when they close. So there's going to be something to true up or a working capital adjustment. Now, how that working capital adjustment is calculated is important. Now, how the tax effects impact that working capital adjustment. You start getting down to real dollars. You know, your tax identity, the tax reps, tax covenants. What if something else comes up after the sale? Comes up a year later. What's your exposure as a seller remaining, and what's your exposure as a buyer going forward? So all those things are important. So just don't skim over the tax aspect, because tax attorneys and CPAs can add value. And then, I mean, this is just key questions before you draft the agreement, and some of it we touched on. Is there, one thing I wanted to, is the seller expecting, probably the last 2 points we probably want to touch on, make sure. Is the seller expecting some reinvestment from the buyer? Meaning, okay, you're going to have another 10% stake in the new company. I want to keep you as an owner that has a lot of goodwill. I want to make sure you're still invested in the succession of the new company. So I'm going to have to okay, I'm going to sell the company to you for $10 million, but I'm going to ask you to invest $1 million back into the new company. And then if there's another exit after that, you can share it. I've seen that. Or there are other incentives. Is there an installment note to the seller? I mean, the seller's got to hold a note for a certain period of time. So that's the way for the buyer to make sure the seller is still interested in the business. Because they want that business to succeed, they want payment on the note. And how long they're on the hook for that. So those are important things to consider. And then, are there other seller incentives? And what are they? And we're going to touch on incentives next. And what's important from an employee standpoint, customer relationship. And Seth's going to head that up, so that's kind of a nice little segue into that aspect of incentives. So with that, I'll take questions or hand it over to Seth.
Well, you know what, before we do, I just got, I mean, a bird just told me something. You want to see a tax guy get embarrassed? Today's his 40th birthday.
Because Ken and Son's birthday's today too.
I know.
That's why.
I know. Very good.
My office is all decorated with black balloons and there's stuff all over. I was gonna say it up front, but we're a little behind.